The conclusion chapter or section of a research thesis is one of the most important and often essential components or parts of a research report. If we compare the other parts of the research thesis to the roots and branches and leaves of the research process, we can compare the conclusion section to the fruit of the whole research process. So it is very important that we need to know how actually to structure the conclusion chapter of our thesis and to understand what are the basic components or contents of the conclusion chapter. So we will briefly discuss the structure and contents in this presentation. So mainly there are 5 components or contents in the conclusion chapter. The overview, synopsis or recap section, the summary of findings section, a discussion section, the conclusion section, recommendations and implication sections, and limitations and suggestions for further studies section. So there might be variation in this structure or in terms of the particular words that we use for, or the terminology that we use to name these sections, but this is generally the general structure around which the conclusion chapter is actually developed and structured. So the first section, the overview section or synopsis or recap, whatever you call it, in this section, there is a general brief summary of the whole research process, beginning from the research topic, the research aims and objectives, the general methodology followed for this research, so a brief summary of that, and then the main findings and conclusions. So all summarized perhaps in a page or 2. Then the second one is the summary of findings section. Here, our findings that we have included in detail in our data analysis chapter are summarized. So generally these are in numerical or form, or in, you can say, in bullet forms. And here the summary of findings is actually in terms of statements and sentences, and generally there is brief summary statistics if we have conducted quantitative researches, or brief statements if we have conducted qualitative studies, and there could be a combination if we have conducted mixed method research studies. So the findings generally are in bullet forms. The findings are generally arranged in line with the order of the research objectives. So, for example, findings with reference to objective number 1, findings related to objective number 2 of the research, findings related to objective or research question number 3, or hypothesis number 1, 2, and 3. So the findings in summarized form are presented here in bullet forms, and generally in response to or in order of the objectives of the research objectives or questions or research hypotheses. So this summary of findings is generally then followed by a discussion section where the researchers actually discuss, critically analyze, and discuss their research findings in the light of findings from other similar studies or studies that have already been conducted that are available there in the literature review, and where there are findings that are similar to or opposite to the findings of this particular study. So that section is actually a critical analysis and objective analysis of the findings in this particular study by the researchers themselves. This discussion section is generally then followed by a conclusion section. The conclusion section, so there could be a broader conclusion, or there could be several subparts of the conclusion section based on the main findings of the study. So generally in the findings section, there is reference to data, whether it's quantitative data or qualitative data. But in the conclusion section, it is generally the researcher themselves who are concluding. So here you do not need to refer back to data such as to statistics or to textual data, evidence from textual data. In the conclusion section, you as a researcher, you are actually concluding on the basis of the whole research process in general, especially on the basis of your main findings. You are concluding what you have ultimately come up with. So that is something that is a very, very important part. So here in the conclusion section, again, the researcher needs to be very objective, very critical, so that the conclusions are actually based on the findings of the study. They are not conclusions out of the outside the scope of the findings or the implications of the findings. So these conclusions should be pretty much based on the findings, so that there is generally avoidance of the subjectivity or agenda on the part of the researcher. Then comes the recommendations section, or in some cases this section might also be called the implication sections. So in many cases, generally in quantitative studies, researchers come up with recommendations based on the findings because there is a more concrete evidence for recommending things. But in many studies, especially in qualitative studies, instead of recommendations, the researchers write implications, where there is a bit of caution in terms of coming up with interpretation and in terms of coming up with recommendations. So implications are something like recommendations, but there is more caution on the part of and more carefulness on the part of the researcher to suggest things based on their findings. And so there is more role for the reader of the report to actually come up with their own implications and their own interpretation of the findings from the study. So once more, whether it's we call these recommendations or implications, we need to be very clear that our recommendations have a sound grounding in our conclusion and in our findings, and that we are not recommending things that are very general in nature, that are actually not represented by the findings of our study. And so we need to be very, very careful in terms of coming up with recommendations based on the findings of our study, the conclusions of our study, keeping in view the scope of our study and keeping in view the particular context and situation in which the study has taken place. We also need to keep in mind the generalizability of our findings to other situations. And so we need to be very, very focused in terms of coming up with recommendations. In many cases, students come up with recommendations that are very general in many cases, that they do not have enough support in the findings of the study or in the conclusions of the study. And so examiners look at these things very, very critically. And lastly, limitation section is the section where the researchers actually acknowledge if there are any limitations, any issues in terms of the research design that they have adopted. So any possible loopholes or weaknesses that were beyond their control, and that could have implications for the research process, for the outcomes of the research process, and for the design, for the research design. So those limitations or possible weaknesses, either in the research design or in terms of the findings that they have come up with, or in terms of the study's implications and conclusions, this is something that needs to be included in the limitation section. And the very last thing generally is suggestions for further studies. So in many cases, research students and other researchers are generally expected that they also need to give suggestions for further research, because research is not something that ends with a particular research study. It's a reiterative, cyclic process. Every research results in many answers, but also in many questions that need further exploration. And so good researchers can give suggestions for further studies. So those further studies could be suggested in terms of coming up with different research designs, with different research methodologies, different data collection and analysis tools, with different samples, with different geographical locations, different situations, and so on. So further suggestions for further research actually will help other researchers in taking the research process further and exploring the issue or issues related to the particular issue that has been explored in this research in further detail.